let's remove the wheel with a 22mm socket. Remove all 6 of your lug nuts. Now you can take the wheel off. 19mm socket, let's remove the 2 caliper 2 bracket bolts. I'm going to start with this one. Leave this in a few threads. That way it holds the caliper while you take off the top one. Okay, take that out. Take out this lower one now. Hold the caliper so it doesn't fall off. Slide it out, and I like to put it up on top of the upper control arm. That way it's safely positioned here. It doesn't fall off, and especially does not put any pressure on this brake hose. Also, when you put it down here, make sure it doesn't pinch the ABS wire and damage it in any way. Now you can take the pads out. You might need a pry bar for this. There's one kind of stuck in there. That usually means that there's rust buildup on the caliper bracket, so we'll need to pay close attention to that and clean it. Take out the other one. Now we can remove the caliper bracket. I'm going to break these free by hand first because they are very tight, and unfortunately I can't get an air impact in here without a swivel. So I'm just going to go ahead with an 18mm socket, loosen these up, and then the impact gun can do its thing. Okay. Leave this one in a few threads to hold the bracket while you take off the top one. Remove the bolts and remove the bracket. Set this aside. Now we have a T30 set screw on the rotor. Go ahead and remove that. Be gentle with it. You don't want to break your socket, but you also don't want to strip out the bolt. Now you can remove the rotor. Usually the hub will be a little bit more rusty than this, unless you live in a climate where rust isn't an issue. But either way, you want to clean off whatever's on here. For me, I just have some old anti-seize that someone put on here that I want to clean off and apply some fresh anti-seize to the hub. If you have rust buildup, then you want to go ahead and use a wire brush or even a sanding disc, depending on how severe the rust is, and clean it all up. Make it a nice and flat mounting surface for the new rotor. Otherwise it won't mount flush and you'll have braking issues down the road. So you definitely want to make sure that this is a clean surface. You have no debris, sand, or rust, whatever you might have here. Get it all off and then apply a fresh coating of anti-seize to protect it. All right, now that this is all clean, usually I would rinse it down with brake parts cleaner, but this is literally perfectly clean. So take some anti-seize, and the areas you want to focus on are this inner ring here and this outer ring here. This part is recessed in a little bit, so if you want to put some on, go ahead, but it doesn't really affect anything just because it doesn't sit up against the rotor. So I'm just going to focus on these areas where the rotor actually sits on. That way it can be, well, first of all, rust-free, hopefully, but also it will allow the rotor not to seize up on the hub if it is on here for a very long time. Don't put too much. A thin layer will go a long way. If you put too much in here and it's caked on, it will actually squeeze out when the rotor goes on and after you torque the wheel, and it will start flinging everywhere. So that's not good. Try to avoid getting it on the lug studs as well. You don't want the threads of those to be coated with anti-seize. You want those nice and dry. Okay, that looks good. Let's get the new rotor on. You have 2 holes on your hub. One is not threaded, the other one is. And you want to line up the rotor with the threaded hole so that you can put your set screw in. So make sure you line up one of these 3 with the threaded hole. Now we also have the coated rotors that have a special coating on them. Usually if you get the plain rotors, they'll have an oil coating on them. You want to use brake parts cleaner and a rag on both the front and the rear surface to clean that off. This is not the case for us, like I said, but you definitely want to clean off the oil on those. You don't want that getting on your brake pads. Next, let's put our set screw in here. Make it snug, not too tight. It's just here to hold the rotor on. On the bracket, let's remove the anti-rattle clips, set those aside. I guess this is a little rustier than I anticipated. So you want to take a wire brush get all this junk off of here. If you need to sand it down, go ahead and do so. I'm probably going to have to do that just because of this rust buildup. If you remember, the pads were kind of stuck in the bracket. I needed a pry bar to take them out. You shouldn't really need one. So it looks like this side is okay, but this inner pad is, well, it needs some cleaning. So I'm going to wire brush this outer part, and then that should be good. That's pretty clean. And then, of course, do the same thing to this side over here. This one is fairly rusty as well, but mostly on the inboard side. So I'm going to wire brush the outside, and then I'm going to take my little sanding disc and sand this part so that it looks like that, nice and clean. You want this to be nice and flat because, as you saw earlier, if it's not, the pads get squished in and they won't move in and out as you apply and release the brake pedal. That'll cause braking issues. Now that the surfaces are clean, you want to add a thin layer of grease. Don't put too much, because once you put the anti-rattle clips on, it can squeeze out and get onto the brake rotors. And that's not good. That is not what you want. So just a thin layer, enough to coat it to prevent it from rusting in the future and avoid this issue. Of course, both sides. And once this is done, if you put too much on, just wipe it off. Take your new anti-rattle clips. These have a slightly different design to them. These springs, you'll notice on the originals, face down. On these ones, they face up, and they act as a pad spreading spring to basically push the pads away from the rotors after you're done applying the brakes. So set these down, make sure they are fully clipped in. You don't want these popping off. There we go. If for some reason you can't press them down all the way, you might have not cleaned enough. So keep cleaning. But these are all set. They're secured in here. At this point, I want to take the two slider pins out. I'm going to do them one at a time so that I don't accidentally mix them up. Clean off the old grease and double check that this ridge up here is clean. This one is not the best looking, so I'm going to clean it up in my wire wheel. You can take a wire brush to it if that's all you have, but basically you want to make sure that it's nice, clean metal, and we'll apply some grease to it so that it seals up against the boot and prevents water from getting in here. Now, because I had somewhat fresh grease in here, I'm not going to bother cleaning the slider bore here on the caliper bracket. Sometimes it's needed, and if you have dirt, rust, or debris in there, you want to clean it out with a bore brush. And of course, in that case, you might want to also replace the boot because it's probably bad. But for me, it's good. So I'm going to put a little bit of grease in here. Now, I know this looks like a lot, but I'm not going to put a ton on the slider because if I do, it's just going to get washed off as I try to slide the slider in. So I'm going to pack the grease in here and then lightly coat the slider. Of course, you want to make sure, like I said, you get it up in this ridge here. And now that this is coated, go ahead and work it all around. Slide the slider boot in, or the slider pin into the boot. Squeeze it in all the way, and there's probably some excess air in here. If there's any excess grease, it'll come out at this point. Wipe it off and do the same to the other side. Now let's take our freshly cleaned caliper bracket, slide it on here, put the bolts back in. And you can bottom them out and then torque them to 221 foot-pounds. There's one. There's two. Let's put the pads in. You'll notice that they look a little bit different. The pad itself doesn't, but the backing on the pad does. The one that has the larger backing goes on the inside, and you want to make sure that the wear indicator goes on the top. That way, as the rotor's turning, it pulls the wear indicator away once it does wear down and notifies you that you need new brakes. If you put it on the bottom, it'll actually get pushed into the pad and, well, it might not work. So slide the pad in. If your pad doesn't slide in easily like ours did, you probably didn't clean the bracket enough and they're getting stuck. So go ahead and clean more. And now you can put the outer pad in. Slides easily, that's perfect. Now before you remount the caliper, you want to push the pistons in. This has dual pistons, and you can use multiple tools for this. You could even use some large pliers. And if you do use pliers, just keep in mind that as you push one in, the other one might come out. So hold it with something or do whatever you have to do. But basically, go very slow, push both of these in all the way, and that will actually make room for the new, thicker pads. Continuing with the caliper, I'm going to put a little bit of grease on the face of the pistons here, on the outer ring, and this is going to help the pads operate quietly and smoothly. I'm going to do it to both, of course. I'm also going to apply a little bit to these ears of the caliper for the same exact reason. Now take your caliper, slide it over the pads and over the bracket. Make sure it lines up with the slider pins. Press them in if needed. Just like that. Put in the two caliper, two bracket bolts, and we'll bottom these out and torque them to 77 foot-pounds. Now, I didn't mention this before, I'll mention it now. Either of these bolts, these or these, don't put grease or anti-seize on them. If you're going to put anything, use thread locker. Definitely don't lubricate them with grease or anti-seize. .77 foot-pounds. You can use a 19mm wrench, stick it in here on the slider if it's spinning, and use that to hold the bolt while you're torquing. Let's get the wheel on. Put on all 6 of your lug nuts. .140 foot-pounds. Double check them. At this point, you can do the same thing to the other side, pump up your brakes, and take it for a road test.